everyone, and welcome back to another 3E solutions-based sales training. I am Samantha from Safeopedia, and today we are joined by 3M. 3M is going to be discussing the complex respiratory and general safety solutions for the pharmaceuticals industry. As always, the team is going to be discussing those pain points, challenges, and help you answer any of those tough questions you might have. With that said, make sure you get your questions or comments into the GoToWebinar console, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Today we have Kathy Thompson, Andrew Gill, and Dana Robinson from the 3M team helping you all navigate through this course. So I'm very excited to have you all sit back, relax, and enjoy this presentation. With that, you guys, jump into it.
Great, thanks Samantha, and hi everyone, happy Friday. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. I think this is our third or fourth session that we've done with the 3E model and talking about specific segments. So as Samantha mentioned, my colleagues Kathy and Andrew are here. Kathy is our senior application engineer who has responsibility for the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors. And Andrew is a North American program manager who handles all of our key accounts in the pharma segment. So definitely experts. So what we're going to start off with is we'll give you a bit of an overview of the industry itself and some trends that we're seeing. Then I'll pass it to Kathy, who will go through some of the key hazards, likely the pain points that are keeping health and safety managers in the pharma industry up at night. And then Andrew's going to get into some tips and tricks on how to sell more effectively into the pharma segment, followed by some solution-based selling that details some key questions to ask when you're in those having those discussions with customers. So just before we get started, please just keep in mind that this is based on our current US federal regulations and certainly not meant to be a substitution for a certification, safety certification course. We just ask that you don't distribute this outside of your own organization, and 3M owns the rights to the presentation. So with that, we will get started. So today we're going to talk to you about a very complex industry, the pharmaceutical industry. So many of you, I'm sure, have had some dealings in the industry. There are a lot of nuances, certainly a lot of complex respiratory solutions required. So it's one that we do a lot of training internally at 3M for our sales reps on, and I know from discussions with AD and many of you that it's something you'd like to learn more about as well. So when we look at the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, we really have four different kinds of organizations there. We've got our branded manufacturing plants that do, your name brand manufacturing of products. We've got the generic companies that basically wait until the patents run out, and then they tend to manufacture a larger scale of different solutions and products. We've got R&D labs, which have a smaller manufacturing footprint generally, but do a lot of innovative and laboratory testing on site. And then, of course, many of them are dealing with active ingredients. So Kathy's going to get into what constitutes active ingredients a little bit later on. So and for reference, we're not talking here about individual pharmacies, just the manufacturing side. So we've done some really detailed modeling at 3M to try and get an appreciation for what the addressable market is for PPE solutions. So we anticipate that the addressable market prior to COVID overall for all segments was about 3.5 billion. Of course, we saw a huge increase in that last year due to COVID, heavily skewed towards the healthcare industry. But as you can see, give or take, the pharma industry makes up approximately 9% of what we anticipate the overall addressable market to be. So certainly a very good opportunity and one that is in need of those complex solutions, as I indicated earlier. So when we look at how that breaks down by portfolio, as you can see, our solutions for the pharmaceutical industry are very heavily weighted in the respiratory realm. So particularly on the powered and supplied air side, reusable respirators, some DR as well. And then of course we've got some Fall Pro solution, which is largely confined space, and some hearing, which is generally on the production side. So, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus most heavily on respiratory, and we will touch a little bit on some of the hearing and confined space solutions as well. So when we talk our segment selling methodology, as I always say to our sales team, you're product experts, but we can't expect you to also be experts in every single segment that you service in your territory. So the idea behind these trainings is to try to help you win in these industries when you're talking to a health and safety manager who has 30+ years experience in the pharma industry, for example. So we look at the industry as a whole, and then we break that down by some of the key applications that generate some hazards. We delve into the hazards more deeply, and then we look at what product solutions are available to mitigate those hazards. So in pharma, more than any other segment, we're trying not to boil the ocean here. We want to make sure that we're identifying what the biggest problem is, and then we work to solve that. And ultimately, we've found that other conversions come along with that. But certainly being able to understand the overall industry and to ask the right questions is really important as you're dealing with these pharmaceutical health and safety managers. So with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague Kathy, who's going to go through some of the hazards that we see most prevalently in the industry.
Okay, thanks, Dana, and hello, everyone. So I'm Kathy Thompson. I'm going to be the technical person for this presentation and also a technical resource for you as you need to learn more about pharmaceutical industry health and safety hazards. One of the things that's unique about pharma compared to maybe some of the other industries you might sell safety equipment into is that pharma needs to protect not only the worker, but they have concerns about protecting the product and the process as well. So many of these process locations might be clean rooms, might have a need to minimize contamination of the product. You've probably heard some of the stories in the media about product contamination concerns in pharma. So keep in mind that the people buying PPE in pharma are using that PPE not just to protect the worker, but need to make sure that that PPE helps with any protection needs for product and process as well. Next slide, please. So we're going to focus on 4 key hazards for this pharma presentation and introduce you to some of the terms that you might hear, because there are some terms that are somewhat unique in this industry with regard to the health and safety aspects. And we want to make sure that you've heard those terms and you know what they mean. So the first term is this active ingredient term, and usually health and safety managers would term it API, so they would add the P in there, so active pharmaceutical ingredients. You will hear them talk about the need to protect their workers from exposure to the API or the actives. And these are the things that are in the drugs, even the drugs that maybe you're taking. If you look at the label, you'll see active ingredients listed, the things that are in the drugs that make the drug work. And so they're biologically active chemistry, but the workers, so think about the fact that you maybe as a patient are taking these drugs, you need a little bit of that active ingredient to resolve your disease or your health concern. But the workers are exposed to large quantities of these active ingredients as they're making them in the plants, processing them, packaging them. That large quantity of active ingredient is not good for somebody to be exposed to, and sometimes, depending on the type of ingredient, not good for them to be exposed to even a very, very small amount. So very important to keep workers from being exposed to APIs, and that's where a lot of PPE selling opportunity exists. Another big focus on hazards is with regard to disinfectants and cleaning. So in pharma industry, because as I mentioned, they want to protect the product and the process as well as the worker, they often have to use some pretty intense disinfectants and high-level cleaning products to be able to keep the process and product areas clean and microbial free. So we're not talking about the disinfectants you're using in your house to maybe clean off your countertop. We're talking about some very potent chemistries. And so it's important to keep their workers, again, keep their workers from being exposed to these disinfectants and cleaning products. Confined space, Dana already mentioned, and so confined space is still an area where we're going to focus on worker hazards in many industries, pharma included, and then production noise, which tends to occur more in the packaging lines. Okay, next slide. So we're going to give you a bit more information on the whole API and disinfectant exposure concern, because that is, again, somewhat unique. You probably haven't been listening to that kind of talk in any of your other presentations. So this is just enough to get you comfortable with having a discussion with a health and safety person in pharma. When it comes to disinfectants and cleaners, they're going to have things that range from simple detergents to very, very, like I said, high-level potent chemistries. You're going to have alkaline agents, chlorine agents, solvents, and then the few that we want you to kind of focus on are peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide. They're also going to use some sterile isopropyl alcohol in pharma. So you're going to hear me talk about these terms, peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide, a little bit more. Okay, next slide. When it comes to disinfectants, there really are just a handful of chemistries out there, and they come in a variety of concentrations and a variety of formulations, but really it's this handful of chemistries that you see listed here that you're going to run into whenever you're dealing with people working with disinfectants. And the reason is there's only certain things that can get to what we call the efficacy, the ability to kill, and have all the other properties that allow them to be EPA registered as disinfectants. So next slide, please. The main one in pharma that has the biggest exposure concern right now, and it's somewhat of an emerging concern, but if you talk to a pharma health and safety person and mention peracetic acid, or PAA for short, or even some of the trade names, Spore Cleanse is an example of a trade name of a product that contains peracetic acid. You know, they will often their ears will perk up a little bit because they know that it's got lots of hazards. I've kind of listed them all for you here. It happens to also be present with other chemicals at the same time. This is just the nature of the chemistry. So not only do they have to be concerned about the peracetic acid exposure, but the hydrogen peroxide and acetic acid that come along for the ride. Next slide. And then I mentioned APIs. So we've got the disinfectants, and now we've got those active ingredients. The APIs, as I mentioned, are the biological active or pharmacologically active ingredient in the drug. Sometimes you might hear them referred to as potent compounds. If they talk about potent compounds, then they happen to have APIs on site that are very, very biologically active. In other words, it takes a very small amount of that drug, of that active ingredient, to create some biological effect. And often these might be things like the hormones or nicotine or something like that just doesn't take much to create this biological effect. Therefore, they don't want their workers exposed to this at all. So this is where you will often see the full garb, the full PPE as shown in this picture with the PAPR and the head top and the shroud and all these things. This is where your sales opportunity is large too, because they don't want workers exposed to these particular ingredients. Okay, next slide. So where does that exposure occur? It's really any place where the API is handled. And keep in mind, the API is a key ingredient, so therefore it's throughout the process. First, they have to start by making that API. And it's usually either going to be a chemical process or a biological process. So you've maybe heard the term biopharma, which is really just APIs that are made through biological means. And especially now in the age of COVID and vaccines, you know, biopharma is really becoming a big deal in the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry. So you've got API exposure as you're making the API, then as you're recovering it from your manufacturing process. Anytime you have to handle it, transfer it, mix it, you're mixing it into the other ingredients for final packaging. So exposure occurs everywhere throughout the entire process. Okay, next slide. This is just a few schematic ideas of how a pharma plant might be laid out, especially if it's going from having an R&D facility and then a pilot plant and a manufacturing facility all in the same location, which can happen. Sometimes these things are separate geographically, but sometimes they're all together on one site, for example. So as Dana mentioned, laboratories will still have exposure opportunities and PPE opportunities. These are just some of the terms you might encounter. And then you have pilot plant facilities where they're scaling up drug manufacturing, and then the actual production processes as well as packaging. Next slide, please. A few other terms we want to just introduce to you. Occupational exposure limits, or OELs. You've probably heard that term before. That term relates to all kinds of chemicals that are in a workplace where you want worker exposure to stay below. So an OEL exists for a solvent, for example, or a dust like silica dust. But APIs often would not have an OEL. So things that are in pharma are a little more sophisticated chemically. They're kind of novel or new chemistries. They're often proprietary, especially in the branded facilities that Dana mentioned. They're proprietary to that company. So therefore, there's not some public external agency. There's no OSHA PEL for those chemistries, but workers still are exposed. They still have high toxicity. So we need to understand how to control them. As industrial hygienists or safety professionals, we need to be able to have sort of a guide for how we're going to control or apply respiratory protection or other PPE. So often in pharma, they use this process called control banding or occupational exposure banding. Next slide. And really how that ends up is that things would be bucketed into like maybe 5 different buckets is very typical. So you see here on the top, OEB 1 through 5. And then really what that bucket or that band would relate to is some of the initial toxicity understanding of the chemistry, which is kind of where those other numbers come from at the top. But I want you to focus more on the PPE selection. So a pharma company would bucket their chemistries into these bands. And then they would say, okay, if I have a band OEB 4 or 5 chemistry, which is kind of getting into that potent compound range that I talked about before, so you especially kind of want to focus on those potential customers that have OEB 3, 4, and 5, because those are the more toxic compounds. Obviously, the more toxicity, the more PPE. So you can see in here where the PAPRs, the powered air purifying respirators, start to come into play is as you get higher up in the banding process. So you can spend a lot of time talking about this. This is just mostly meant to be an introduction to these terms for you. Okay, next slide. And then don't forget that we have noise. So we talked about noise as being mostly from packaging operations. There can be a few others, but 3M has lots of solutions for noise exposure and even for communications in noisy environments. So production noise is another hazard that you can encounter in pharma. And next slide is the confined space. So lots of opportunities for process containers, vats, tanks, reactors, things that you see pictured here, where people maybe need to enter those to inspect, to clean, to take care of some sort of repair. And so there are confined space entry opportunities that are part of the process areas, as well as certainly the physical plant itself. Okay, next slide. And don't forget, with confined space, you have the hazards of oxygen deficiency potential and flammable or explosive atmospheres. So pharma tends to use a lot of flammable chemistries, flammable solvents, and there could certainly be opportunities where you have to be careful about flammable and explosive atmospheres in confined spaces or elsewhere. And that would also drive, by the way, a need for intrinsically safe products. And that's all I have. So
Great, thanks, Kathy. And please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. We'll leave a few minutes at the end to address those. And now I'll pass it on to Andrew to go through some of the tips and tricks on how to win in the pharma industry.
Thanks, Dana. Hello, everybody. Dana, could you just jump to the next slide and we'll get going? Thank you. So, as Kathy mentioned, when we think about engaging from a sales perspective with a pharma account, it's really, these are unique customers. The health and safety managers are highly educated, many cases masters degrees, PhDs, they're certified industrial hygienists. So this is not your typical sales call that you're going to walk in and carry the bag in and show them product. You have to look at the relationship as more of a collaborative approach with the health and safety professionals at these sites, be there to answer their questions. If I can encourage you, learn about the customer, learn about what they're making. If you want to, and in many cases, these customers, they're effectively fortresses. They're not easy to walk up to and bang on the door and get inside. If you're looking to meet some of the health and safety professionals who work at these companies, I encourage you to join local chapters of health and safety societies or industrial hygiene societies, and you'll find that they take part in these outside groups. Once you do have engagement, you need to be show thought leadership. We have 3M has a pharma dedicated site on our personal safety division page. You can steer the customer there. You can go there yourself, pull down. We have white papers, we have product information. So when you do those questions, you can answer those questions. Additionally, sorry, I'll talk about that on the next slide. Next slide, please, Dana. So just if you have an opportunity to engage and you're looking for support from 3M, you're not alone in this. We have an application engineer dedicated to pharma, Kathy, who just spoke. She's there to answer questions. However, we also have a wide fleet of personal safety specialists throughout the country. If you don't know your local 3M safety specialist, you can actually go to the 3M personal safety page and just type in your local zip, and up will pop the local 3M safety specialist, the local 3M fall protection specialist as well, if you have questions around confined space. So you're not in this alone. You've got the resources from our website, and you also have the human resources to work with you on these calls. Next slide, please. So, if you do get some engagement, one thing that we're finding when we deal with both the PP category managers, the purchasers, and the health and safety managers, is they're looking for help just to rationalize their SKU count. And this is not unique to pharma. Everybody knows this. But as we went through COVID, there was a scramble. And like in this image, we've got someone wearing a disposable respirator. In many cases, they were just getting disposable respirators wherever they could. So just bear in mind that if you work with your local 3M safety specialist, we can work with you to identify opportunities for rationalization. We have launched a lot of new products. 3M is known as an innovative company. So in many cases, they may be using old, eyewear that are prone to fogging. Well, we've got our Solus eyewear with premium anti-fog that we can bring forward. We've beefed up the production of certain models of disposable respirators, which we can help you migrate them to because we have very robust, strong supply. So take advantage of that. The other thing is when we get into some of the bigger products, like we talk about PAPRs. PAPRs are, they're not cheap. They're $2,000 each. Sometimes they want to do a trial before they commit. 3M has a demo center that you can work with your local 3M safety specialist. Bring in a demo, let them try it for a couple of weeks, and then you can work hand in hand with a safety specialist to answer questions around the trial and hopefully pull through the sale. Next slide. And that leads us, if you are doing a PAPR demo or you're talking about PAPRs, you may hear comments such as, oh, well, we use disposable respirators or we use the reusable elastomeric respirators. They work fine. Well, maybe, but think about that when you're wearing just a half-face respirator, there's a lot of skin exposed. Look at this image here of this worker. This worker's got a fully integrated PPE solution there. They've got the respiratory protection that the blower unit is battery power. It's pulling the air in, it's filtering, it's bringing it up through that breathing tube, in through their head top. They've got nice comfort of a nice cool flow of air coming down over their face, their entire head, their neck, their face is protected from splash. So instead of having multiple pieces of PPE and pulling it together to create a solution, you've got really just one piece of kit that's bringing them that comfort. And in many cases, it may become more economical for them once they get over the initial purchase, the capital expense of the PAPR, but they'll see increased worker productivity. They're happier workers, they're more productive workers. So we've talked about respiratory, and again, we cannot forget confined spaces. There are VATs. There's many VATs in these facilities. Many considerations around how they do maintenance, how they enter, and it's not just confined space. It's also working at heights. And again, this is where you're working in tandem with your local 3M safety specialist. You can go there, you can work together. You have a safety specialist. You also have a working at heights fall protection specialist who can help on specifying the appropriate gear, maybe a David arm, and maybe something as simple as just a reach pole that they may need to enter the confined space. But that's part of a complimentary service that our specialists will provide and help you in terms of answering those queries for the customer. So always remember that you've got the power of the 3M DBI brand there that's there to support you. But not only do you have the product, you also have the consultation side of things as well to help you answer their questions and hopefully pull through a sale for you. Next slide. So let's just talk about some questions that, once you engage with the pharma account, what are some key questions? So we talked about pharma. Well, we're not even going to talk about production to start. We're talking about cleaning and disinfecting. And as Kathy alluded to, through COVID, this has become a hot topic. We talked about the peracetic acid. So a great question to start off is just an open-ended question. Tell me about your current PPE PPE protect or your respiratory protection plan, or how many workers do you have in PPE? And that's just going to open the dialogue. They're going to tell you. That's probably just going to lead to the talking about their pain points. Make your mental notes. And here on the right, this is an example of some aspects of our offerings that we see used quite frequently in cleaning and disinfecting in not only pharmaceutical environments, but this is also applicable to food production as well. So I alluded to glasses, fogging. Well, like the glasses there in the middle and the goggles next to them have a very high-end Scotch Guard anti-fog, premium anti-fog that is just beloved by the market. You get situations, if we look at the lower right, well, look, what's this? Well, this is an example of our Peltor headset communications. Not only does it provide hearing protection in loud environments, it actually has a two-way radio integrated into the headset. So instead of just hand gestures and waving arms, workers can communicate with each other without having to remove hearing protection and just talk into their boom mic. So they have their hearing protection, but they can also communicate with each other. Next slide. So let's move into working with the APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. And again, much like when we talk about cleaning and disinfecting, sort of very common questions. What PPE are you wearing? Tell me about your PPE requirements. It's going to open up. It's going to open the dialogue for you to hear what their pain points are and propose potential solutions that they may not be aware of. Generally, they know solutions may be there. They're typically going to be asking about the specs on solution. They may ask you, say, yeah, we have a problem with, again, communications is one, or again, it's the fogging of the eyewear. Is that, oh, by the way, 3M, they've got a Scotchgard anti-fog, premium anti-fog that it's relatively new. They may have been using the same models of eyewear and goggles for the last 5-6 years and not aware of that. So I'm not going to go through all these questions, but these are just great questions, and you'll all have access to them to put them in your toolbox of questions to ask when you're in the field. Next slide.
And speaking a bit about intrinsically safe, just before we move on.
Oh, absolutely. So absolutely, when we look at our suite of PAPRs, we have 3 key models. We have one, the TR300 Plus, which is a HEPA only, so particulate only PAPR, and that's the one on the right there. We also have one called the TR600, which is particulate and gas and vapors. And then we have the TR800, which is very similar to the TR600, takes common filters and cartridges. However, it is an intrinsically safe PAPR. So when you've got an environment where you have a risk of explosion, and the customer say, hey, what do you have? Is this PAPR intrinsically safe? You go to the TR800. And then it's actually the only UL rated class 1 div 1 intrinsically safe PAPR available on the market in the US today. So great solution if they are looking for a PAPR where they may have have a risk of explosion, where they may have been using, maybe they were using a disposable respirator historically, and they need to make that step up based on their control banding methods that Kathy alluded to earlier. Thank you, Dana. So then we move on to packaging. So we've produced, this is actually an area where you're going to hear more questions around noise, that they have trouble with noise, loud environments exceeding the threshold, where they actually do need to put their workers into hearing protection. We have many options so again, what are the questions? Tell me about your hearing conservation program. Do you have good compliance? Do you have claims for noise-induced hearing loss? If you have claims for noise-induced hearing loss, if we look at the lower right, that EarFit validation system, for those who aren't familiar with this, this is actually a method to test earplugs, and you can test all 3M hearing options. So we have a very, very broad offering in terms of hearing earplugs. Typically, if you've got 3 to 5 different models of plugs, and you will get a very good, successful fit with one of those on workers. And then it's recorded. It's recorded in a database. The worker, the management knows who's been ear fit tested, and they know which model of plug they've been tested on. And that can really, it's as a way to drive down your long-term noise-induced hearing loss claims. Additionally, you've got options for plugs that are, some are roll down. If they don't want to roll the plugs down, you can just use the push-ins. Like, there's no roll down. You just grab that little blue stem on the earplug, and the earplug inserts nicely into the ear, and there's no there's no worries about the worker having to roll down the plugs. And we talked a little bit about the Peltor comms in an earlier slide. Again, this is a great solution in a situation where workers need to communicate, but they also need hearing protection. So instead of pulling the earplug out to communicate with a colleague, they go to a Peltor comm. There's no lifting of the earmuff because they can have situational conversations face to face. If you look at that headset, there's a little small mic on the lower part of the cup of the earmuff, so that you can have face-to-face conversations. It will isolate the colleagues, or will isolate the colleague's voice, block out the surrounding noise. You can have a face-to-face, but you can also talk through your two-way radio in your headset. And again, maybe you don't need those high-end eyewear options, so we also have sort of good, better, best eyewear, and the Virtual would be a great option that we see used in packaging. Next slide. And then finally, confined space. Very technical conversation. If you're not comfortable with those conversations around the applications, you can ask the questions, you can take preliminary notes, but I can strongly encourage you to avail of a 3M fall protection specialist who will be more than happy to accompany you to a site. And again, you can use if you're not sure who your local 3M fall protection specialist is, you can use our, go to the 3M Personal Safety Division homepage, and you just drop in your zip, and you will it'll pop out who your safety specialist and who is your fall protection specialist who can accompany you. But I would encourage you just to ask some of these questions, gain some preliminary responses, and then reach out for help, and we'll be more than happy to accompany you or answer those questions. So thank you, Dana.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So we wanted to share with you some sales resources that we've put together. So we've got a number of 3M created resources. We're going to circulate after this call this presentation deck, as well as a quick reference selling guide. So you can expect to receive that later today. I've also provided a quick link to the pharmaceutical page that Andrew referenced earlier. We also have a specific 3M pharmaceutical safety solutions brochure for you. Kathy and her team have also put together a number of really great technical bulletins. So when we speak to the fact that many of the health and safety managers in the pharma industry have a strong industrial hygiene background, many of these may be really helpful to them. So we'd encourage you to circulate to them if something comes up in your discussions about peracetic acid or hydrogen peroxide, OEB, that sort of thing. We have those available for you as well to kind of share some best practices and some guidance. Kathy, do you want to speak to those external resources?
Sure. And so the two links at the bottom happen to be government databases, so US government databases. The first, the Toxics Release Inventory database, that's an EPA link that industrial facilities who have certain chemicals on site in certain amounts have to file a report, and that report becomes publicly available information. So it's a nice tool if you take your geographic area that you're responsible for and use that link. You can look up which facilities have which chemicals in large quantities in your geographic selling area. And it kind of gives you a way to zero in, not just on pharma, but really on any industrial facility that might have a lot of chemical use. Pharma is just one type of facility that would have a lot of chemical use. And that kind of just gives you an idea of facilities to target, as well as the types of chemistries that they're using. And then the next is pharma specific, because it's an FDA database. It's a database of manufacturing facilities for pharma drugs. So you can again look up your geographic area there and see what FDA registered drug manufacturing facilities are in your area. So it's a nice tool for identifying potential customers. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. So we've also included some quick reference links to some product-specific information that from some of the key products that we discussed throughout the presentation. So as you can see, we've got a number of powered and supplied air assets for you, as well as a brochure on our respiratory hoods. We've got some confined space assets, and then a bit about that hearing protection fit testing that Andrew was talking about earlier. We've had some customer councils and done that fit testing during the councils, and it's really an aha moment for many of these health and safety managers. So by all means, feel free to touch base with us, and we can help you get a demo unit for that. And then, of course, we've got our goggle gear that Andrew referenced earlier as well, with the premium anti-fog coating on it. So with that, we'll open the floor for any questions. And Samantha, I'll pass it back over to you. Oh, sorry, I forgot one slide. As I mentioned, I think this is our fourth presentation with the AD Safety Network. So we've already delivered presentations on the heavy manufacturing, metals and transportation industries, construction and mining. So we've just provided some quick reference materials there for you if you missed it. So there's a recording to each session as well as the sales guide. And then we're also going to be delivering a session that's similar to this on the food and beverage industry later on in November. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that.
Hi, everyone. What a great presentation. And as Dana said, now is the time to get those questions or those comments in. So if you have any questions for the 3M team, now is your chance to do so. So while everybody is getting their questions together, Dana, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity for anything you think the audience should keep top of mind from this presentation.
Yeah, well, I think definitely the more complex respiratory solutions, that's certainly a big one. And Andrew and Kathy, any other key suggestions here?
Well, I think just don't feel that you have to go it alone from a technical standpoint. We have lots of resources in 3M. We have myself, and then we have a whole technical helpline as well. Every package of our products has that 800 number on it. That's our technical helpline, answered by a technical person who would come then direct that question to me or to one of our product specialists, just depending on the nature of the question. So there are lots of resources for you that you've, some that you've seen here and some even more.
Great. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions pouring in at the moment. So it looks like the presentation was good enough that everyone feels pretty comfortable. So if there's nothing else for today, I'd like to wrap it up by saying thank you to 3M for being here. And of course, thank you to the audience for being here. Without you guys, none of this would be possible. As always, you will be receiving a copy of this presentation for being here today. And as Dana mentioned, if you want to join them again next month for another 3E presentation, feel free to do so. So thank you again, everybody, for being here today. And again, if you have any other questions or they come up later on, feel free to reach out to your 3M distributor or reach out to 3M. Thanks, everybody. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.